Originally asked to talk about the prehistory of Abicum here itself, but sadly, so little is known about the prehistory of a particular community that the talk would have been somewhat short. This flint axe, or a Neolithic flint axe like this in Shrewsbury Museum, I'm not sure this is the actual one, being one of the few prehistoric finds that are known from the area. So instead, as Mel has said, I opted to talk about the prehistory of Radnorshire as a whole, basing it on the chapter I'm currently putting together for the Radnorshire County History, due to be published by the Radnorshire Society in a few years' time to mark their centenary. At first sight, the presence of no more than a single axe from Abicum here seems to bear out the rather unpromising but perhaps slightly jocular summary of Radnorshire's prehistory that appeared in the Royal Commission's County Inventory published in 1913. This says, prehistoric. The antiquarian remains of the district that has become Radnorshire need not detain us, for the broken character of the surface and the high level at which most of the county stands would render it unfavourable and inhospitable district for early man for all purposes, save that of concealment. So, just over a century ago, there was the general opinion that during prehistory, Radnorshire made a good hiding place, but was of little use for much else. But perhaps it's the archaeology that's been hiding. Now, it may seem a contradiction in terms, but much of what we know about Radnorshire's prehistory is actually quite modern, in the sense that much of it is a result of research during the last half century or so. Research has brought to light what must be considered to be some of the most extraordinary prehistoric sites that are known in the British Isles. This map showing a distribution of all the things that we know that we can call prehistoric in Radnorshire. It would be rather confusing because it's got dots of all periods. The coloured dots, however, break down into three main classes of information. Firstly, aerial photographs such as this, showing two crop mark ditches here, pair of parallel buried ditches in the Walton Basin. Secondly, the map shows chance finds, such as this bundle of gold found on a hillside near Hayope. And thirdly, humps and bumps in the landscape, such as the ramparts of the Castle Bank Hill Fort. Now, archaeology often begins with questions about things like these that we can see or have been found in the landscape. You know, questions like, what are the crop marks we can see in the Walton Basin? Why was the gold work found at Hayope bundled into a ball and left on a hillside? Who built the banks encircling the upland bridge at Castle Bank? And when did any of these things happen? I'll come back to these three particular examples later on to give an idea of how these different kinds of evidence contribute to our understanding of Radnorshire's remotest past. Before that, let's take a quick look at the special character of Radnorshire's landscapes, which in the past, as in the present day, have framed the lives of people living here. To my mind, the essential character of Radnorshire's topography is captured in the less romanticised landscapes that Thomas Jones of Penkerry painted during his later years in the late 18th century. These show Radnorshire's landscapes that we're familiar with today, with its seemingly endless tracts of moorland dissected by fertile but relatively narrow river valleys. Now, the bare bones of the landscape, its hills and valleys, have changed little since the last glaciation, but there have been significant changes in its appearance over the last 10 or 12,000 years as a result of climate change, changes in drainage patterns, human and animal disturbances to natural vegetation, cultivation, and the creation of meadow and pastures. There have also been a succession of social, economic, and cultural changes which will have strongly influenced the ways in which the landscape was perceived. As an estate owner, Thomas Jones no doubt will have looked with at least half an eye to the income that could be derived from it. How many head of sheep could graze a particular hillside, or how many bushels of corn could be harvested from a particular field. In his more picturesque paintings of the Radnorshire landscape, he looked at it from a more romanticised point of view, however. But how were these landscapes viewed in earlier times? No doubt people got to know places where game could be readily trapped, or which were rich in wild fruits, places where going was easy or life was hard, places that were welcoming, places that were hostile, and landscapes which over the course of time acquired mythical or spiritual significance. Now, these are the particular forgotten landscapes I'm alluded to in the title of my talk, and which I'm hoping we may be able to discover something about. So, when was Radnorshire prehistory? For convenience, we can divide it into the following conventional periods. The late Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic, the Old and Middle Stone Ages, between about 10,500 and 4,000 BC, say, were periods marking the earliest human presence in Radnorshire following the last glaciation, when the area was visited by hunter-gatherers, a period which was cool at the beginning but gradually warmed up. Next, the Neolithic period, or New Stone Age, between about 4,000 and 2,300 BC, a period which saw the introduction of farming to Britain and including the cultivation of crops, the herding of domestic animals, though settlement may still have remained transitory. Then the Bronze Age, between about 2,300 and 800 BC, when metals, copper and bronze and gold, first appeared, and when permanent all year round settlement may have begun. This was a period when the climate was fairly kind, but became wetter later on. And then finally, the Iron Age, starting in about 800 BC and ending with the Roman conquest in about AD 50, when by convention, history begins. To put these overall timescales in some sort of perspective, if we think of human activity in Radnorshire since the last glaciation as being an hour, then the first 55 minutes of that is prehistory. It would be a mistake to think of prehistory as a single continuous process of development. No doubt things happened in fits and starts, with periods of growth, periods of recession, pandemics and famines, with the comings and goings of different peoples, different ethnic groups, with different ways of doing things. However, as I hope we'll see, there are hints that Radnorshire's prehistory has a quite distinctive story to tell, involving patterns of movement through the landscape and seasonal exploitation of upland and lowland resources, ways which have characterized the ways of life of people living here since very early on in the county's history. So let's look at a bit more detail at the distinctive story that Radnorshire has to tell us about each of these periods. Now, this is the first of various period maps that I've produced for the forthcoming county history, which I hope are partly legible and which will help helpful in giving an idea of where things are. Now, during the late Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods in Radnorshire, as I say, between about 10,500 and 4,000 BC, Radnorshire was being visited by small groups of hunter-gatherers, probably on a seasonal basis. Evidence is limited to chance finds. The earliest sign of activity coming from here at New Radnor, and also represented by this flint implement at the top left, which is potentially the furthest inland of a cluster of late Upper Paleolithic finds that are also found in cave and open air sites, a late glacial period extending lower down the Wye Valley. Mesolithic activity between about 9,500 and 4,000 BC is shown by the other kinds of flint tools known as microliths and the flint axe, also shown in this drawing, which are again likely to represent seasonal visits by family groups catching wild animals for food, as well as fishing and gathering wild plants, nuts and fruits. The concentration of these finds in the Walton Basin may reflect the greater amount of field work in this area, but it also perhaps suggests that the early movement of peoples up and down the Wye Valley and its tributaries, connecting with communities as far afield as the shores of the Severn Estuary. From an early date, the Wye and its tributaries are likely to have formed important wildlife corridors for migrating herds of cattle and deer, moving seasonally between lowland valleys and upland grazing, which in turn will have influenced the annual cycle of movement of hunter-gatherer communities, also exploiting wild plant resources available at different seasons. The size of populations in Radnorshire during the Mesolithic is likely to have been small. We can only really guess at what the population size was, but it may actually have been no more than several dozen people, but possibly rising and falling depending upon the seasons. One interesting thing is, since the flint that these people used for their hunting tools does not occur naturally in the county, it shows that there were long distance contacts already with other places where it can be found, perhaps as far afield as glacial deposits in Glamorgan, or on the west coast of Wales, or in the North Cotswold area, or perhaps even as far afield as the Wessex Chalklands or the Yorkshire Wolds. Now we begin to learn more, I think, about Radnorshire's prehistory from the Neolithic period onwards, between about 4000 and 2300 BC, a period which saw the beginnings of agriculture. Fairly widespread but localized low-intensity land use is suggested by the distribution of characteristic stone tools, such as distinctive types of arrowhead, shown here as blue and purple dots, used in hunting and fighting, and flint and stone axes, shown here by red dots, such as the one we've seen from Abicum here, used for felling trees and also for carpentry. It seems likely that settlements were scattered, small scale, and possibly still only occupied seasonally. Pollen evidence shows that cereals were being cultivated, but perhaps only on a small scale, shifting from place to place. It seems likely that over time, the herding of domestic animals became more important than the growing of crops, and that human lifestyles remained nomadic or semi-nomadic in nature throughout the Neolithic, perhaps replacing or evolving from a Mesolithic economy based on the seasonal movement of wild animals. The Neolithic was also the first period that we know that monuments of various kinds were built in the landscape. Ideas of what was happening in Radnorshire during the Neolithic period is most clearly shown by the remarkable cluster of ritual and ceremonial monuments here in the Walton Basin. Looking westwards here from direction of Herefordshire towards Radnor Forest and the hills of Mid Wales. So the Walton Basin is one of the sort of big and significant lowland areas within Radnorshire as a whole. The Neolithic ritual and ceremonial monuments I've mentioned were first identified by aerophotography, including the crop marks of buried ditches, which we saw earlier. We now know that these lines form just part of a remarkable complex of monuments, shown here in red, together with the blue dots showing distribution of the many thousands of flint artifacts found by field walking here. Now, the Walton Basin complex includes two of these so-called the parallel ditches called cursus monuments. It also includes a type of site we call a causewayed enclosure. I'll come on to talk about these different types of sites in a bit. It includes 3 timber palisaded enclosures, an unusually large circular ring ditch, possibly the 4-stone stone circle, and a large mound at Knapp Farm. The stone circle and the mound being the only 2 monuments in the complex which are still visible above ground level, and which weren't found, which aren't known simply by aerophotography. Now, the earliest in the sequence of monuments was probably a causeway camp at Womerston, covering an area of just under 2 hectares, about 4.5 acres, built in the early Neolithic, about 3,500 BC, as a seasonably occupied settlement or ceremonial centre. This appears to have been superseded by the pairs of widely spaced ditches closed at the ends that we know of as cursus monuments. The image on the left shows an imaginary reconstruction of the Walton Green cursus, and the photograph on the right shows the deep ditches on the sides of the Hindwell cursus to give an idea of their scale. Now, the Hindwell cursus, which bisects the basin, is one of the largest monuments of this type known in Britain. It was up to about 4.6 kilometres, almost 3 miles in length, and appears to have divided what became a settlement area on the west side of the Walton Basin from a ceremonial activity to the east. Now, the settlement is represented by a cluster of middle and later Neolithic stake-built houses excavated at Upper Ninepence in Old Radnor, shown here with a reconstruction of similar buildings found during the excavations at Durrington Walls in the Stonehenge area of Wiltshire. Interestingly, the houses at both places are associated with quite a distinctive type of pottery known as grooved ware. Now, we know from study of the pottery and the residues on the pottery that beef was one of the main foodstuffs being consumed early on, but later there seems to have been a switch towards the consumption of pork. The cursus monuments, the long parallel ditches, were in turn superseded by 3 palisaded enclosures built successively between about 2,900 and 2,700 BC. The larger of the 2 Hindwell enclosures, shown at the top, encloses an area of 34 hectares, about 84 acres, and is amongst the largest Neolithic enclosures known in Britain. Built of up to about 1,200 tree-sized posts. The so-called Walton palisaded enclosure, shown at the bottom previous slide, associated with a possible avenue of posts, shown in this imaginary reconstruction to the right. Now, the scale of some of these posts, you imagine that each of these trees that they were cut down with these flint axes that we've seen. Some of these posts of the Hindwell palisaded enclosure, where traces of the posts were found. They're tree-sized posts, some of them up to about 1 metre across. Say 1,200 of these posts, which would have required felling, lopping, transporting, and then raising up by means of ramps, and possibly stood to a height of 3 or 4 metres above ground level. Now, the construction of these monuments clearly demanded considerable human effort and resources, and must have helped to forge a strong and abiding sense of place and communal identity amongst the people that built it. These types of monuments are found elsewhere in the British Isles. Cursus monuments like this. The purpose is uncertain, but suggested that they may have been used to create divisions within the landscape or for ceremonial processions. This reconstruction drawing shows the Walton Green cursus pointing towards a gap between Burverbank and Herrick Hill, leading to the Hindwell Valley and eastwards out of the Walton Basin towards Herefordshire. Now, this view, which was kindly brought to my attention recently by Lucy Trench, is from the other way around. It's a long Hindwell Valley from the west and shows the setting sun at the time of the winter solstice. The question of whether the orientation of the cursus monuments had astronomical significance is something that hopefully someone more competent than me will explore more fully in the future. However, it hints at the ritual events taking place here in the Walton Basin at particular times of year, as well as potentially indicating a distance of travel of people moving into and out of the county from the direction of the Herefordshire lowlands. Seasonal movement obviously being something that governs the life of the nomadic peoples, which seems to have been probably the mainstay of the Neolithic economy still. Likewise, the purpose of palisaded enclosures, built of this extraordinary number of trees that were felled down, palisaded enclosures which superseded the Cursus monuments, remains equally enigmatic, but they may in a sense represent a big outdoor arenas or symbolic big houses defining spaces set aside in the landscape for gatherings and for ritual or ceremonial activities. Amongst the latest of the sequence of Neolithic monuments in the Walton Basin is a large 100-metre diameter circular ditched enclosure near Walton Court Farm, Old Radnor, built in about 2400 BC, again discovered by aerophotography. I'll go back to my previous slide, sorry, jumping around. I can get there, yes. Again, found by aerophotography, shown in the aerophotograph on the left. It's interesting to note that the ring ditch is about the same diameter as the ditch enclosing the first phase of Stonehenge, although Stonehenge monument is earlier, several hundred years earlier, and there's also much larger ditches. Also, possibly of late Neolithic date, are the Knapp Farm mound, which you see on the side of the road at Knapp Farm, which may have been used for burial, and the four-stone circle. These later monuments are noticeably much smaller and appear to foreshadow those of the Bronze Age that we'll come to later on. The monuments in the Walton Basin were built in succession and seemed likely to represent a major regional cult centre which lasted for over 1,000 years, between about 3,500 and 2,500 BC. This had evidently become a special place in the landscape, sited at a focal point along a major routeway leading to the heart of Wales, that had possibly become a landscape cleared of woodland by grazing animals or groups of human hunter-gatherers quite early on. A focus of this Neolithic cult centre may have been the Summergill Brook, which runs across the Walton Basin and which in almost magical way disappears during the summer months, here looking like an old trackway, only to reappear still in the summer at a series of springs that are now occupied by the artificial pool at Hindwell Pool, which is the source of the Hindwell Brook. Now, this coming and going of the Summergill Brook again hints at an element of seasonality in the ceremonial, cultural, ritual activities that were taking place within the Walton Basin. Now, the Walton complex is of considerable significance within the Welsh borderland. It's probably the only centre of this kind for many miles around. The scale of some of these monuments and the human effort that would have been required to build them is truly astonishing, and likely required the participation of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Now, rather than assuming a permanent population of this size, it seems more likely that the complex is best explained by the coming together of large gatherings of people at certain times of years or on particular occasions, drawn from much smaller and widely scattered communities. Now, comparison can, I think, legitimately drawn with the Stonehenge landscape, another major Neolithic cult centre, where a long-lasting sequence of monuments, which, like the Walton Basin, included a causewayed enclosure, Cursus monuments, palisade enclosures, and also a natural spring, in addition to Stonehenge itself, of course, which had evidently been built to align with the winter and summer solstices. So again, an element of seasonality. And a landscape, Stonehenge landscape as a whole, which appears to have been a scene of seasonal feasting and gatherings, which I rather naughtily put on a modern seasonal gathering at Stonehenge. Perhaps in a Radnorshire context, the Royal Welsh Showground might also provide an analogy. But in the Stonehenge landscape, it's obvious that the monuments there were drawing people from considerable distance away, involving the movement of goods and animals for the feasting, as well as the Stonehenge bluestones themselves, transported all the way to Preseli, possibly via a land route beyond Radnorshire's southern border, and a block of sandstone, which recently is known to have been hauled all the way from northeast Scotland. So, I mean, truly amazing things were happening in the Neolithic period at these particular centres, important centres during the Neolithic period. Contacts with Neolithic communities further afield, Radnorshire, as far as northwest and eastern England, Wessex and South Wales, are again shown by sources of flint, stone used for implements, distinctive styles of pottery, and also by the close similarity of the types of monument known elsewhere. As in the Stonehenge area, activities in the Walton Basin may also have involved long-distance movement of animals on the hoof. Well, to move on to the Bronze Age in Radnorshire, which we see quite a totally different social and cultural landscapes emerging in Radnorshire here between 2300 and 800 BC. The Bronze Age sites and finds are now spread more widely across the country and appear in both upland and lowland areas. The large communal monuments, which we've seen in the Walton Basin, went out of use and were replaced during the early and middle Bronze Age, as elsewhere in Britain, by a myriad of smaller and much more widely dispersed monuments, including burial mounds, smaller scale places of ritual and assembly, such as stone circles, ring cairns, and standing stones, monuments which could be built by and seem more appropriate for smaller family-sized groups of people. These include monuments such as these two burial mounds, excavated burial mounds on Llanell with rocks overlooking the Royal Welsh Showground. Now, monuments like this are widely scattered throughout the uplands and lowlands of Radnorshire. The Llanell with circular mounds have stone curbs and were built in a period between about 2100 and 1700 BC. The earlier one at the bottom had a large grave that may have held a log coffin. The one at the top had a central kist in which somebody could be buried like this. We know that they are buried in a crouched position. We know that they were buried with a beaker vessel, like this one from another site shown here, of which we only found which a fragment survived, together with a broken flint arrowhead of a typical Bronze Age type. As well as being places of burial, we should perhaps also think of these round barrows as having played an important role in mapping out the landscape, laying down markers, staking ancestral rights and privileges to particular areas of land and its resources, anchoring individual kinship groups whose ancestors were buried there to places within the landscape. Permanent settlements are as yet unknown in Radnorshire during the earlier part of the Bronze Age, and it's possible that the lifestyles of people during the earlier Bronze Age or even Middle Bronze Age in the county, still perhaps numbering no more than a few thousand people permanently, continue to be essentially that of nomadic herders moving seasonally from place to place, though it seems likely that permanent settlements will have been established later in the Bronze Age. Characteristic Bronze Age chance finds are known throughout the county, shown here by these coloured spots. The appearance of metalwork and metalworking in particular has been seen as a catalyst for social and cultural changes which took place. The presence of prestige items, weapons and ornaments, such as these earlier Middle Bronze Age finds, hinted the existence of exchange networks and the emergence of tribal identities. Explicit evidence for the presence of social elites, chiefdoms, and other forms of leadership is also suggested by the presence of a relatively small number of much larger, more complex burial monuments, as well as by precious finds, such as the ball of gold work that we, I'll go back to my previous slide, sorry. The ball of gold work here from Hayope that we saw earlier on, found on a hillside above the Team Valley. When unwrapped, it could be seen to represent 3 Middle Bronze Age ribbon talks, which have been bundled together, shown here following restoration and now in the National Museum of Wales. Now, it's possible that the talks were bundled together and hidden with the intention of recovery, but in comparison with similar finds elsewhere in Britain of gold work, which has been wrapped together and then placed in places in the landscape, suggests it's more likely that they were deposited for spiritual or votive purposes. Such valuable ornaments will have been widely recognized as symbolizing the status, wealth, authority, or persona of the individuals or individuals that wore them. Such individuals may have been leading figures within contemporary society or belong to important lineage or kinship groups. As I say, similar finds of gold work crushed into a ball are known elsewhere in Britain, wrapped around each other in a way that would place them beyond the world of the living. The sheer act of deposition reinforcing an association between the wearer, wearers, and a particular place. Particular place within the landscape. A number of similar gold finds have been found in similar locations elsewhere in Radnorshire and in adjacent counties. The deposition of the Hayope talks may, for example, signify the death of the wearer or the symbolic combining of possessions, rights, or obligations or allegiances of different individuals or communities. So I think we should move away from simply saying, oh, they were hidden so they could be recovered. I think there's some more symbolic reason for their deposition, where they were deposited. Well, to come on to the Iron Age, it's our final prehistoric period between about 800 BC and the Roman conquest in about 50 AD. Again, quite different landscapes, social and cultural landscapes made an appearance. This was the period which saw the introduction of iron tools and weapons alongside the continued use of copper alloy for items such as ornaments and horse harness. Climatic deterioration and other environmental changes are likely to have made settlement and land use in the uplands more challenging and led to greater competition for land and for its resources. As elsewhere in Britain, there were marked changes in the types of monuments that were constructed. The burial mounds that were such a feature of the earlier Middle Bronze Age landscape had stopped being built in the later Bronze Age. Instead, we see the construction of enclosed settlements, including larger hill forts, smaller defended settlements, and ditched enclosures, which we perhaps take to represent the earliest expressions of land tenure by different family and kinship groups. Differences in size and location of these different forms of settlement seem to have chronological, sociological, and economic significance. Pollen evidence from Radnorshire suggests that woodland clearance continued apace, potentially signalling a significant increase in population. Towards the end of the Iron Age, Radnorshire fell on the boundaries of the loosely defined tribal territories of the Silures to the south, the Dimetae to the west, the Ordovices and Cornovi to the north and northeast, and the Debuni to the east and southeast. Tribes whose names we know mostly from Roman written sources. It is unknown, however, whether the peoples living in the area that we now know as Radnorshire were at some point affiliated to any of these historically attested tribal groupings, or whether they may have belonged to one or more lesser tribes whose names have gone unrecorded. As in the Bronze Age, there are hints of social elites, perhaps again suggesting chiefdoms or other forms of authority and leadership, in this instance suggested by a hierarchy of settlement forms. The larger hill forts, shown here as red dots, smaller defended enclosures, shown by yellow dots, and undefended ditched enclosures, shown by the white dots, mostly in the Walton Basin area. Sadly, none of Radnorshire's hill forts have been excavated, and we therefore have to rely upon details of their form and location in comparison with similar sites elsewhere, which have been excavated more fully elsewhere, for an understanding of their dating and what they can tell us about the social organisation, economy and land use in Radnorshire during later prehistory. Some of these intriguing questions are illustrated by Castle Bank Hillfort Glascombe, arrowed here, coming back to our third major source of evidence of Radnorshire's prehistory, surviving earthwork sites. Now, Castle Bank Hillfort occupies a dramatic ridge of igneous rock in the upland south east of Llandrindod Wells, and with its outer defences representing an outer enclosure, an original outer enclosure here, later enlarged to the south, with another annex with breaks here, and with entrances like the one shown on the left. Defences were built of stone and were probably originally faced with impressive dry stone walling. This site in particular, I'm grateful discussions with Julian Ravest and Toby Driver, who got deep knowledge of the site. These three enclosures seem likely to have had different functions. The terraces in the northern enclosure were dug to accommodate rows of timber roundhouses, which would have appeared something like this, reconstructed buildings at Castell Henllys in Pembrokeshire. The enclosure appended at the southern end shows no certain signs of building platforms, suggesting that it may have been used for overnight corralling and protection of animals which graze the adjacent upland pastures during the hours of daylights. As well as hill forts like Castle Bank, there were smaller and generally lower lying enclosures protected by banks and ditches, which I've previously said, shown by the yellow dots here, whose plans I can show here, which seem more appropriate in size to individual families or kinship groups. And there were also smaller undefended enclosures, largely in the Walton Basin area, which are represented by cropmark enclosures, non-defended sites. Two of the enclosures have been excavated in the Walton Basin, or partially excavated, and have been shown to belong to about the 1st or 2nd centuries BC. It's probable the local Iron Age population depended mostly upon wooden and leather vessels, but interestingly, This decorated pot, found in one of the ditched enclosures in the Walton Basin, was made in the area of the Malverns in Herefordshire, again showing links between Radnorshire and places further east. Now, one or two of Radnorshire's hill forts are much bigger than the others, such as Burfer Bank, indicated here on the Walton side, on the eastern side of the Walton Basin. And perhaps significantly lying next to and possibly in some way controlling traffic along this major routeway between Mid Wales and what is now the English Midlands. Today, the hill fort is largely hidden by woodland, but LiDAR imaging, stripping away digitally the woodland and scrub, which now covers it, reveals a large and complex monument of about 6 hectares, or about 14 acres, with 4 entrances. Now, this large and complex monument gives more the appearance of a tribal centre. So, in the Iron Age in Radnorshire, we see a hierarchy of different settlement forms. Strategically sited larger forts, such as Burfer Bank, capable of accommodating a large number of people and looking almost like proto-urban tribal centres. Smaller hill forts, such as Castle Bank, looking like they may be associated with the seasonal exploitation of upland grazing by perhaps extended kinship groups. Smaller defended and undefended closures on the upland edge or in the valley bottoms, which have more the appearance of having been farmsteads occupied all year round by small family groups, though perhaps are still of some status, owning and exploiting defined areas of farmland. Many questions remain unanswered, however. Were all the different types of site being occupied at the same time? What do they tell us about the social and economic lives of Iron Age peoples that lived in them? Do they represent different facets of a single society and systems of land tenure that combined the exploitation of upland and lowland resources? The size of Radnorshire's population during the Iron Age is again no more than guesswork, but estimates for the whole of Britain suggest a crude figure of perhaps 4,000 or so. Now, could such a figure have been accommodated within all the known settlement sites, or were there other types of unenclosed settlement in Radnorshire during the Iron Age, not visible to the naked eye, which we have yet to discover? A hint of the important lines of communication to the east and west at the very end of the Iron Age is suggested by the distribution of Roman campaign period forts in period about 60 to 70 AD, when the Roman army was subduing the native Iron Age population. Now, for whatever reason, these campaign period forts seem to avoid most of the areas where there are hill forts in Radnorshire, but it's uncertain actually whether the hill forts were actually still occupied at this date. The more permanent Roman forts in Radnorshire, dating to, which lasted into the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, are shown here. As well as having a military purpose, these Roman forts would also have played a role in civil administration and taxation of the native population. Their distribution hints, as one would expect, that the richer and more heavily populated areas at about the end of the Iron Age were in the main river valleys. Well, there's clearly much more still to learn about Radnorshire's distinctive prehistory. But to summarize, there are hints at the very early in the history of the economy of the county is characterized by an extensive pattern of land use combining the exploitation of upland and lowland resources, beginning with a seasonal movement of hunter-gatherer groups in the later Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic in pursuit of herds of wild game. In a sense, morphing into an economy based on the seasonal movement of domesticated animals by nomadic herdsmen who gathered seasonally in large numbers at Neolithic cult centres, such as those in the Walton Basin, with its large timber and earth monuments. Now, the building of burial mounds and other monuments during the Bronze Age, denoting the emergence of smaller kinship groups establishing rights over particular parts of the landscape, the presence of elites, but ways of life still dominated by that of potentially of nomadic herders moving between upland in summer and lowland in winter, and then perhaps on to the establishment of more permanent settlements later on. And then finally, in the Iron Age, with its suggestion of greater concerns with competition and defence, more explicit suggestions of land tenure, and a potential hierarchy of settlement forms appropriate to tribal, extended kinship groups and individual family units, with the seasonal patterns of exploitation potentially integrating lowland cultivation and upland grazing. As in more recent centuries, wealth was perhaps measured by heads of cattle and other livestock. Long-distance contacts, as in earlier periods, possibly related to surplus production being moved on the hoof and traded or exchanged further afield. Now, I have to thank various people who've helped me to, in this quest to discover British prehistory, including the images from various bodies, especially HENEB, the Royal Commission and the National Museum of Wales, whose images I've shown in my talk. And so with the coming of the Romans and the first written records, the story of Radnish's prehistory, like my talk, comes to an end. And as I say, the rest is history. Thank you very much for listening.